I'm Carol Looper, a member of CMC's Board of Trustees, and I'm a retired journalist, although you never retire as a journalist. Today's forum, Change Comes to the Heartland, OSU in the 60s, is brought to us with support from the Robert Weiler Company, represented here by Mr. Weiler and many of his associates and friends. Please help me thank them. It is indeed timely, with protests seemingly a weekly occurrence on campus and over at the State House, that we look back to a time when students' voices rose up to challenge the status quo and set in motion changes that would be totally foreign to students of today. Well, they are getting the president-elect on the Ohio State University campus tomorrow, although I am told it is closed to journalists. Escorts on dates, mandatory military training, segregated housing. Seems like another time, another place, but indeed, this was the Ohio State of the early 1960s. We're honored to be visited today by several of those who walked the Oval as students in these times, each with a different background and different perspective. So please welcome newspaper publisher and former Ohio State Senator Ray Miller, retired OSU administrator Mabel Freeman, retired communications executive and former news director of WTVN Radio, Bill Patterson, and our host and retired OSU Vice President of Business and Finance, Bill Shkurti. Bill, the conversation is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carol, and thank you all for coming today. We're going to talk about a time when the country and the community were bitterly divided, when inflammatory rhetoric was the order of the day, when Middle America lost confidence in all our key institutions, and it was an open question as to whether the center would hold. No, we're not going to talk about the 2016 election again. We are going to go back 50 years to Columbus and Ohio State University in the middle of the 1960s. And what we'll talk about are the events that came out of that had a great deal to do with shaping the kind of university and community we are today, and also explore what possible lessons this might have for the future. Now, before we begin with our distinguished panel, I just want to set the context a little bit. As you all know, the 1960s were a period of tremendous turbulence and protest, particularly on college campuses, and particularly on large college campuses with large numbers of students. The interesting thing is that through most of that period, Ohio State was relatively quiet. There were protests, but they were within defined boundaries. In fact, the university was so benign that President Nixon was thinking of coming here to give the commencement address in the spring of 1969, when a lot of other universities were closed and were dealing with turmoil. President Nixon turned out couldn't come because he had to meet President Tu in Guam to announce Vietnam troop withdrawals, which is fairly important. So he sent his vice president, Spiro Agnew, to the campus, one of the more divisive and polarizing figures of the 1960s. Yet Vice President Agnew spoke and was treated politely here on the OSU campus. Yet 10 months later, the campus erupted in a spasm of violence and protest that not only was unprecedented for Ohio State, but was among the worst in the country. It resulted in a lot of property damage, the university being forced to close for 2 weeks, more than 800 arrests. And the question you might want to ask is, how could a place that was so quiet erupt so violently in such a short period of time? And that's one of the questions my book tries to answer, and also one of the questions about then what did the university do as a result? Our panel is going to explore some of those issues from the perspective of people that were there and are part of the Columbus community. So the way we're going to work this out is we're going to look at three different issues. The first one is kind of where we were before the protests in the spring of 1970, what it was like, then what kind of change that caused on the campus, and then finally what lessons, if any, are applicable for where we are today. So what I'm going to start doing is to ask each member of the panel to talk a little bit about what it meant to be a student or reporter or media person at that point before all the change started. And since so much of the energy towards that change came from the black students that were at Ohio State, I'm asking Ray Miller to lead it off. And I've asked all three of the panelists to give us a sense of what it was like to be here then, but also to be cognizant of time, because we want to allow enough time for questions and the other issues to come forward. So I will gently nudge people along as necessary, but I hope you get a feel from what Ray and Mabel and Bill say of what the campus was like just as this stuff all started to come to the surface. So Ray, why don't you kick it off?
Sure. Thanks very much, Bill. It's a real pleasure for me to be here and to share, and I think we're going to have a real rich conversation, just judging from looking at old people like Phil Moots and others in the audience. You know, it's very interesting for me coming to the university. I started in the spring of 1968 after having graduated from Columbus East High School. So I came from an all-black environment at Columbus East High School to the Ohio State University that had a handful of black students at the time. I came at a time, and you will all recall this, of protests and assassinations. And so there was a lot of hope that all of us had as we came to the university. We had elected this young, dynamic president, John F. Kennedy, and then he was assassinated. And we remember that. And certainly I remember it very clearly within my neighborhood along in 18th Street, and how everybody ran out and protested and tore things up, and all kinds of things that were happening in a very negative way because of all the hope that we had for President Kennedy. Then the assassination of Martin Luther King, then the assassination of Malcolm X, of the assassination then of Kennedy, and then King, and then Bobby Kennedy. Exactly, that occurred in that order. And so there's what's laying the foundation for the student unrest. It's those things, even before we started dealing with the issues on the campus. So in '68, you know, I pledged a fraternity, which was completely irrelevant at that time. I don't know why I would want to pledge a fraternity, but I pledged Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, and so that became irrelevant because of all of the student protest. So I got actively involved within that at the time in all of the student protests with our Black Student Union and Afro-Am, African American organization that we had put together. Afro-Am was a little bit more militant than the Black Student Union, and so we'll talk about that later. Under the leadership, I would say, of Afro-Am, of Ako Kamban, and Jawanza Naishuma, whose name still remains Paul Cook.
Hey, great. Thank you, Ray. Mabel?
I think our situation as a woman was a little bit different. There were a lot of women at Ohio State, more men, students in those days than women. But I look back and I think, how could I not have seen what the challenges were? But when you're in the middle of a culture that this is the only way you've been treated as a woman, it didn't seem to many of us as horrendous as it really was. I came into the university in '62. There's one thing we all have to reveal our ages on this panel. This is most unfortunate.
You first.
But when I was an undergraduate at Ohio State, women had hours. Men didn't. The university said, well, that was part of in loco parentis. Well, it was only in loco parentis for women. And you know, the little humor, which was really not so funny as you think about it now, was that, well, if the women were locked in, the men had nothing to do anyway. And you just, okay, you started thinking, why are we limited to what time of the day we can be out and about? Women could not wear pants, even to dinner or to lunch in the dining commons if you lived in the residence hall. But we'd grown up wearing skirts. I went to public school. I grew up in Philadelphia, and you had to wait till, as a little kid, till the temperature was a certain, a degree before you were allowed to put pants under your dress. And you thought that was the norm. I think one of the most telling events while I was at Ohio State in this protected group of women was within about a year and a half time, we brought to campus, the student government had Betty Friedan, who had just written The Feminine Mystique, and Miss America. And we weren't sure who we were supposed to be. And in many ways, that defined the 60s as to, where were we on the continuum? There's a little bit of irony on that story. Unfortunately, I didn't get to go to the airport and pick up Betty Friedan. I was in the group that picked up Miss America. Hardly my style, but this woman who was Miss America, not until probably 2 decades later did you hear her name again. And it was Marilyn Vanderburg, and she was the first public figure to talk about incest and say that she had been a victim of it. She couldn't do that while she was Miss America, but 20 years later, she was able to talk about that. So the 60s for women were really defined as we went to college thinking we were supposed to be good little girls, and we graduated realizing that there was more to the world than what we had thought when we arrived. And I would note very quickly, I can count on probably one hand, I might need a hand and a half, how many women faculty I had. When I was at Ohio State, they were all white men who were on the Board of Trustees. They were all white men, almost to a person. They were in administration. And indeed, most of the faculty were. And so we were, I'm sure Ray could say, there were no role models for us. Most of us, based our professional decision on what we learned maybe from a high school teacher. And that's something that as I look back and as I became an administrator at the university, I continue to be very sensitive to the role models for young people.
Okay, great. Now, Bill, you were kind of on the outside looking in as the news director for WTVN at the time, so give us a sense of your perception.
Well, it was kind of a combination. I came to Columbus in 1962 from OU after graduating in broadcast journalism, and immediately got a job at WTVN, and within a year I was named news director. And I was only a year out of college when all this started going on, including the Kennedy assassination. So my whole body was kind of shocked about what was going on and what the hell kind of profession I got into, especially after I was the one to read the bulletin on WTVN that Kennedy was dead. And I could hardly broadcast after that. So that was a horrific beginning for me as a journalist. And in the 60s, it was not going to get any better, as everybody has outlined. I would call it the decade of death and destruction. It seemed like every day somebody was dying or being assassinated, or there was a riot. And this was more toward the late 60s than the early 60s. But then to make it more complicated, I decided to get my master's degree. Actually, Gene D'Angelo, my boss, told me to get a master's degree. I was already working 50 hours a week, and I had 2 kids, and he said, go get a master's degree. I said, yes, sir, because you do not say no to Gene D'Angelo, especially when he's paying for your master's degree. So I went up there, and I finally graduated and got my master's degree in '68. So I was now, in '68, at the beginning of the worst part of all of this. I was getting my master's degree. I was writing for The Lantern. I was a news director at WTVN. I did all the morning news from 5 o'clock to 10 o'clock, and I wrote a daily editorial every day. I only say that because as I graduated with my degree, Gene had a big party for me at my favorite library spot, which was Benny Klein's. And so all my friends were in there, and all the staff from WTVN, and D'Angelo was there, and he announced to the crowd how proud he was that I could do all of this and still get a master's degree. And then he said, and now, Bill, I'm so excited that you've agreed to get your PhD. At which time I threw my drink up in the air. I went over and hugged him, and I said, please tell me you're not serious. And he just smiled. I think he might have been serious. So a little later on, I'll get into discussing the media and how they dealt with all this, and the political makeup of the media in the 60s was very interesting in Columbus. So I'll save that.
Great. So hopefully you have a picture then of OSU, at least in the early 60s and mid 60s. This was the post-war period of great prosperity, peace at home anyway, and in essence a very paternalistic society where white men at the top kind of controlled things, and if you were an African American or you were a woman, you were kind of treated as a second-class citizen. And if you were an African American, you were a second-class citizen in a majority white institution. So pressure started building, and as the panelists and members, it's external things like assassinations, the Vietnam War starts to pick up, but also internal things. One of the myths that's been perpetrated, I don't think intentionally, but people assume, is that the riots that occurred at OSU in May of 1970 were related to the invasion of Cambodia and the shootings at Kent State. And although those played a role, the big confrontation between students and police, both on campus and Columbus Police, and eventually bringing in the National Guard, occurred on Wednesday, April 29th in the afternoon. President Nixon's announcement of the Cambodian invasion did not occur until the evening of a day later. On Thursday, the Kent State protests that resulted in the shootings did not occur until Monday, May 4th. So other stuff was boiling up here at the university, and people who I interviewed, who were students then, told me, in part, this was not just Vietnam and Cambodia, but a revolt against the university itself. So it shook the very foundations of the post-war order. So that leads us now into the period of protest and change from 1968 to 1970. So I'll let our panelists take it over from there. Who wants to lead off?
Well, I'll jump in again because the thing that was so bothersome was there were not that many African American students, and so in our demands that we had, and we had a list of demands that was written, and so everything sort of evolved around that. All of our protests, our organized protests, et cetera. So we had a very small number of students. We had virtually no African-American faculty. Dr. William E. Nelson came in, who also was my advisor, and Dr. Nelson was so student-centered. I mean, he really was all about trying to ensure that the African-American students were engaged and on the issues as well as certainly in the classroom. And then after Dr. Nelson, we brought in Dr. Charles Ross, who was far more controversial, quite frankly, than Dr. Nelson was. And then Dr. Frank Hale, who had more of an emphasis on bringing in graduate students. But so we had a shortage on the students, a shortage on the faculty, a shortage within administration of African Americans. And as you said, anything that has to deal with the administration or the running of the university, there was an absence of African Americans. And so we were about changing that. And we were about changing that in any way that we felt was necessary. So it was organized protests. It was shutting down buildings. I had to knock a fellow out myself. And so that kind of thing that went along with trying to bring about greater equality and greater justice on the campus.
Okay, so you had a core of discontent among the students that was African-American students, but not solely African-American students. And one of the interesting things about the protests in the spring of 1970, although it started with Afro-Am, other students who had other issues, whether it was the war or the way the university was treating students, joined in as well, and they formed a coalition and called for a student strike on the afternoon of April 29th. So that's kind of where we are now. Let me go back and let Mabel and Bill fill in.
Yeah, there's a bit of a conundrum, and Bill knows I've challenged a couple things in his book.
Carefully.
Back in the 60s, we were talking about a campus of 37,000 students. There were not a majority of those students protesting. But it didn't take 15,000. It could take 500, and that really drew the attention. And I think, were there certainly lots of students in sympathy? There could have been, and there probably were. But I think we need to be really clear that for many of the students at the university, they were trying to get a degree. We were still mostly first-generation students. It cost money to be there. We had families who were spending, what seems silly today, $100 a quarter for tuition, but that was big money. And so for a lot of the students, they were not engaged in these protests. And I think that's the reality on a large campus. You have so many different issues and so many different factions. And so I think Bill's point is a valid one. When one thing gets going, it allows other things to coalesce. But even when that happened, you weren't talking about 15,000 students. But the administration needed to be responsive. And the fact that, I give credit to the students who were able to see things in a way that the majority of students hadn't, and who could get the attention of the administration. And I think compared to some other universities, even 1,000 or a couple thousand students were a lot of students to be out there.
Okay, let me get Bill's perspective on this, and then we'll...
I thought the entire situation was just a pain in the butt, quite frankly. Everybody had to concentrate on these demonstrations, and I know now that I'm more mature that they were all for worthwhile causes, and in fact everything they demonstrated for came true. They got what they wanted, and they deserved it long before they demonstrated. So I'm not putting them down for that, but from a newsman's standpoint, when you like to cover city council and you can't, because you got to go to OSU and cover the National Guard showing up or some demonstration on High Street, it kind of gets, you become a little antagonistic. Now, to even make it worse back in those days, I was working for the Taft Broadcasting Company. That's a Republican organization. They're not real kind about riots. And I was writing the editorials that said that. And probably the worst stumbling block that I had in dealing with Ohio State as a reporter was Novice Fawcett. Could not interview him, could not talk to him. He would not hold a news conference. He hated the news media. I had Governor Rhodes and Jack Sensenbrenner's home phones in my billfold. I could call them any time of the day and night, and they would take my call and do an interview with me. But I never interviewed Novice Fawcett. And that was a sad, sad situation that went on through the entire, and I don't know exactly what year Corbley, or who was it followed him? Anderson. But finally, they put John Corbley out in front of the news media, and he did a good job. But I don't know when that was, but it was in the late 60s.
69.
Yeah, when things got so horrible that they realized they'd have to have a major figure, they put him out, and he did do a good job, and he responded to the media. But you talk about listening to all the politicians talk about transparency. We have transparency, which is a total lie anyway. But at that time, there was no transparency. So nobody should be, the reporters shouldn't be complaining about the transparency they have today when we couldn't even interview the president of the university. And to me, that was a big stumbling block.
Well, let me tie that together, because Novice Fawcett's role in this is extremely important. In writing the book, I had the most difficult time getting my arms around Novice Fawcett as a complete person. I had met him as a student, didn't know him that well. People that knew him best said he was a principled and decent man, but he was very structured and he didn't like protests at all. And it was clear, he said that, and he always claimed that it was only 1% of the students that were stirring this up, when in fact, a lot of the students, it's true when Mabel says the number of activists who were actually out marching was relatively small, sometimes 100, sometimes 200, sometimes more, but the number of students who were sympathetic was a lot greater. And one of the things that turned, there was, after the riots occurred and the university closed down, the university did a lot of introspection as to why it happened, because the administration was really caught off guard by the degree to which students were upset with the university. So they did both some scientific polling and some referendums. And one of the polls asked students, this is a scientific poll, so it got non-activists as well, who do you trust? And it turned out that about half trusted the strike leaders, so about half did, about half didn't. A little more than half trusted the much aligned elected student government leaders. An even larger majority trusted the faculty, but something like 92% of the students said they distrusted the administration. Now, part of that goes with the times, but it was clear the administration was not making the connection. The other thing that happened that made this, now, There were other universities, OU and Miami among them, that had younger presidents that reached out to the students. And in fact, they were quiet longer than Ohio State was. But once Kent State occurred, both OU and Miami had to shut down too. That was just like a wave that overcame the individual president as well. So I think it's wrong to blame this all on President Fawcett, but I think a disconnect between the majority of students and the administration helped contribute what happened, because it was a lashing out. The other contribution, there was a tense relationship, I would argue, and I'd be interested what other people think, between the students and the city of Columbus, particularly the Columbus police. And after the strike occurred, it started out very peaceful and very nonviolent. In fact, the strike leaders wanted it that way. But there was a confrontation at Neal and 11th that there was some rock and bottle throwing and then tear gas. And what you hear from a lot of students who are not politically motivated was that, well, we weren't too concerned about this until they shot tear gas into my dorm or my apartment or my fraternity, and I wasn't doing anything. And in fact, a police riot would be too strong of a term, but a police overreaction would not be. And in fact, that got thousands of students out and got them very angry. So that's part of what went into this.
Fueled by the mayor at the time, Jack Sensenbrenner, who also imposed a curfew, and then he led this law and order sort of style thing. The piece that we had up on Neal Avenue really exploded pretty quickly, because it came after a number of other protests and the demands that I referenced earlier that we were pushing for. But sort of the point, Bill, and both bills here. It's bad when you're out of touch. It really is bad when you're out of touch, when you're an educational administrator and your customer base are young students. And so you have a person like John Mount, who was a VP at the university. And we met with all of these people. We went over and met with Novice Fawcett as well. I remember I went over individually to meet with Novice Fawcett, and the secretary said, well, have you ever met the president? And I said, no, I have not. And I used to wear an Army jacket and a black tam. In fact, I wore an Army jacket and a black tam even when I came to the General Assembly as an intern and as an aide before I became a member. That was my uniform, and that was a statement that I was making. So I go over to meet with Novice Fawcett in my black tam and my Army jacket, and he wasn't there, and so we scheduled a meeting for me to come back. When I got there, he had my transcript from day one, laid out over his desk, and he said, well, Mr. Miller, you've been really a good student here. And, I had to maintain my posture. I said, well, good, thank you very much. But I'm here to talk about more African-American students and faculty, et cetera, et cetera. We had administrators, all white males, who were so far out of touch with the students. And then the situation you talked about with the mayor and the governor, Rhodes, certainly exacerbated the overall situation.
We've got about now 5 minutes left on our part before we go to questions. So let me give the panelists one last chance to talk if you see any lessons from this. And I know, Mabel, you've worked with students for a long time. So why don't you kick it off, and then we'll get the other.
Well, I guess I want to put one last aspect on President Fawcett. He was hired having been the superintendent of the Columbus City Schools. He had not been a university president. He was used to students K through 12 and how you work with them. And I think if you had a chance to talk with him, there was a bit of a challenge there. The other challenge was he had a board of trustees with people like John Bricker and others that were really much more in charge of things than he was at times during a lot of the...
And they weren't afraid to let him know it.
Right, exactly. And there were things that he tried to do on behalf of students that the board wouldn't allow. And so, it's not to, he doesn't need a defender, but it was very unusual for such a large university to have selected a superintendent of a school district to be their president. And speaking of the size and of students, the baby boomers arriving at Ohio State created this situation in the 60s that was beyond what they had tried to plan for. As a Franklin County resident, I couldn't live in the residence halls even if I could have afforded it because they didn't have enough space in the mid-60s. And so I think this, what to do with all these students, it was still open admission. And you did. You had a group of older administrators that this was all new and different. I think today the university has a very different relationship with students, and I think it's true across the country. Ohio State was not unique. It might have been unique as far as Midwest and exploding, but at the same time, kind of the culture was not unlike that at the other Big Ten schools, whether for women, for African Americans, about the faculty and administration. And so we learned a lot in the 60s. The button question authority showed up in the 60s. And I think there were many books written on higher ed in the 60s. It has never, ever gone back. And indeed, what was learned has hopefully affected what goes on now at the university. There is a very different recognition of students, undergraduate students, especially, even at a research university. And a university, unlike a city, unlike a state, is a remarkable kind of institution with everything from huge medical complex to thousands of students, the occasional football game. That's, you're managing all of that. And it's a little bit, it's quite stunning, I think, on any given day at this university when you add up the students, the faculty, and the staff and visitors, you're talking 100,000 people walking across that campus. And so even in the 60s, when it was not quite that big, trying to get your arms around what did this mean for all the populations was a challenge.
Mabel, we got about a minute left, so let me give Bill a chance to weigh in.
Just a comment on the city politics, and you brought up the Columbus cops. Mayor Sensenbrenner was a Democrat, but he didn't act like a Democrat. He had two of the toughest safety directors that was ever in City Hall, in Fred Simon and Jim Hughes. So even though they were Democrats, and you'd think, well, they'd understand all this and they'd be, kind. They played the game very rough. The other thing I would like to say in closing is that in the city, you had the Taft Broadcasting Company, which was the leading news station, not the TV, but the radio, who did editorials. You had the CJ, of course, and you had the Dispatch. Then the CJ went out of business. That left only two voices of editorializing in the city, which I always thought was kind of sad, although I was glad to be one of them. But looking back in the 60s, one of your big questions was, will it ever happen again? My friends, it is happening again. Not quite at the same level, but the ballgame isn't over yet. So no matter what the issue is, it looks to me like burning down buildings and throwing rocks and starting fires has really not gone out of style.
Okay. We're going to go to questions in just a minute. Let me summarize, if I may. I think that two of the takeaways, and I spent a lot of time on this in the book, although it was a very destructive period in the spring of 1970, it woke up the university and a lot of good things came out of it. And I think, as Mabel has highlighted, the university is much more student-friendly than it was back then. It's more open to African-American students, although there's still some areas where it needs to improve. The other thing that's changed is the relationship between the university and the city of Columbus, particularly the students in the city of Columbus, has matured and is a wonderfully supportive relationship now when it wasn't then. And the concepts of policing have changed with community policing. I suspect after the riots, the Columbus Public Safety Department did a poll of students and asked the question, do you think the police are your friend? Of the white students, 30% said yes, 70% said no. Of the black students, and there were a large number of them polled to get a statistical sample, not one said yes to the question of the police your friend. Now, there's still issues today, but we have much more professional police both on campus and downtown than we did then, and that is also a good thing to come out of there. And I suspect if you polled students now after what happened last week, safety forces would be very popular. But there is a danger. Gordon Gee always used to tell us, never let more than 49% of the beehive get stirred up at any one time on campus. And I think that's good advice. And there seems to be the potential for a coalition for change, and if change doesn't happen in the right way, to become more angry about that already developing. And boy, how the police and safety forces and the government responds to that can be a force for good, or it can be a force for even more protests. So that leaves us, I want to thank my panel members for their candor and for their observations. Now we have a chance to take questions. So it is the tradition here at the Metropolitan Club to do that. So please state your name, ask your question, and we thank you in advance for not making long editorial comments. And let's proceed with the first question.
Well, thank you. This has been very interesting. I'm Jane Scott with the Metropolitan Club. I'm curious to know what your take is on the current situation in many of our campuses where students are having an impact and not allowing the administration to invite viewpoints on campus that are maybe offensive, or safe zones on campus where you aren't subjected to controversial topics or anything that might offend you. I'm very interested in your comments, especially in comparison to the 60s.
Okay. Anybody want to go first?
Well, I think anything that constricts freedom of speech is wrong. You know, one of the things that we have today, and I'll come back to that directly really quickly, is all of the protests that are occurring, you know, whether it's environmental, whether it's gender issues. Folks are not operating in silos to the extent that they operated before, like all of the black students pushing their agenda. I think now we have the student associations coming together, and they've melded their agendas, and I think they can be more effective. They can be. Right now, I think they're sort of working through that. But it's healthy to have views that you may not be comfortable with. Because someone may be more militant, or someone may be outside of something that you may even morally have some opposition to. You ought to be open to it, particularly at the institutions of higher education.
Let me add on to that. My freshman year was 1964-65, when the free speech movement here hit its peak. And I guess coming from that background, I would agree with Ray and err on the side of free speech. Free speech does not permit someone to yell fire in a crowded theater, as we all know. But the benefit of the doubt should go to free speech, not against it. And so I feel uncomfortable, I think, with the trend sometimes on campuses to be too restrictive.
I would, on a personal level, absolutely agree with both of you. I think some of this may be coming from, if you talk to the mental health counselors on college campuses today, the number of students coming into college who are on medication for clinical depression and issues dealing with the stresses of our society has, I think, prompted some of this response. And I think trying to figure out how we're going to deal with this so that we don't lose the free speech that is so critical to an education, especially a college education. And at the same time, we support the students who are dealing with a lot of emotional issues. I think that's a challenge that's still out there.
Yeah, good point. Okay, next question, sir.
Hello, my name is Mickey Cochran. I'm a guest here today. And my sister was one of the first physically handicapped students to go to Ohio State in the 60s. I'm wondering what the take was from the university side about disability issues, accessibility for students in wheelchairs especially, and also about dyslexia. Students that had the learning disabilities that could not come back into school because they were failing. There was no program at that time at Ohio State to address this issue for those students. I just wonder what the panel's take might be on either one of those issues.
No, that's a good point. One of the things I talk about a little bit in the book is that the civil rights movement had influence over and above just African Americans. It was kind of an opening up to people and accommodating people with different needs and different abilities. And although it did not happen quickly, by the time President Anderson came to OSU, he made it a point to make the campus more accessible to people then that were called handicapped. We now call people with disabilities. So I think one of the good things that came out of the 60s was an acknowledgement of giving people a chance to succeed or fail on their own rather than being treated as a category.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Roger Blackwell. Walter Cronkite used to end his programs on history saying, "And you were there." I thank you for the panel for taking us back to there. I've read the book, and anybody who hasn't read it, you will be back in the 60s and 70s when you read it. My question is really for Ray. We had a pretty substantial, significant, at least black business community then, the Willis Brothers and Crosby Funeral Home and a lot of others. What was the feeling going on in the city? We talked a little bit about the police and the city and so forth. What was the black business community, citizenry thinking and saying about what was going on then?
I'm so glad you raised that. That's a very good point. And you're right, Roger, that they were very active and provided real leadership, particularly to the African-American students and in the African-American community. With everything that was taking place outside of the university, with the assassinations that I talked about earlier, with Carl Brown down at IGA and the funeral directors that we had, they were really playing a major role. And the African-American administrator, there weren't that many in the city government, Cliff Tyree played a central role as well. Bill lays out in his book all of the students that were arrested. There were some very serious charges brought against African-American students, and it was Cliff Tyree and some of those business leaders that convened meetings, helped to raise money to provide for legal defense for all of us that were active on the campus.
Let me add something to that, too, which I think is important. The university, in addition to being an educational institution, buys a lot of things in the Columbus metropolitan area. And one of the things the university has tried to do in fits and starts, it hasn't been as successful as it could, is support minority businesses, which tend to be small businesses. And for a big university to deal with a small business sometimes is a hassle. But I think the university felt when I was there, and still does, that part of its job as a public institution is to help the local economy grow, and that includes helping small businesses, and that includes helping small businesses that happen to be minorities so they can grow into larger businesses. Okay, Mark?
Thank you, Mark Reel. First of all, thank you, Bill, for writing this book. I follow Roger. It's a really worthwhile read. I want to ask everybody on the panel, what surprised you most about the book?
Well, I think it was quite a trip back for us, especially me, being a reporter up there and all that time and being a student at the same time. It was a wonderful trip back, and it kept me up till midnight, which is a hell of a lot later than I like to stay up. But as I told Bill when he came in today, the man deserves some kind of trophy just for the all the notations in the book. And he referred to me, he said, "Yes, Bill, there's 600 of them." And he said, "I loved looking at every one." Okay, there we got the thinking of Bill over there. Good job. He did a good job.
I don't think it was a surprise. One, I was glad he spelled our names correctly. But I think he tried to write a fairly factual book. There was a wonderful book that, and I'm blanking on the author, and I can't believe I am, called When Dreams and Heroes Died, that really was a description of higher ed in the 60s and what it meant for students. And I think Bill tried to stay away from a lot of the emotional part as he was trying to be fairly factual on what was going on. And I think even as somebody who was there, I was a high school teacher in the community in the late 60s, trying to keep our students from going up to the campus when they shouldn't have been. And I think even if you were part of this, it was hard for you to see all that was going on. And so to have the book really gives you a wonderful perspective.
Okay, thank you. The next question.
Thank you to the panel. My name is Frank Reed. I've enjoyed listening to all the stories because, of course, there's so many people who live and grew up in Central Ohio and who have moved here who love Ohio State because they went to Ohio State. I have 3 children. 2 of them are at Ohio State, one also in college, so I'm an empty walleter. But my parents, my grandparents, and everybody could say this. What do you think about the respect authority? When I was at Ohio State in the 80s, there was some question about whether or not the student government should urge the members of the Board of Trustees to divest in apartheid. And I'm happy to say that Ohio State did that, I think, as a result. There was another period after I graduated where there was some complaints about apathy. Students weren't active enough. We've seen some changes. When I was a staffer in the General Assembly, we saw a bill passed. I think Ray Miller was one of the sponsors that put 2 students on the Board of Trustees. Has there been some changes for the good that have kept students engaged and kept universities sort of in balance with what their students' needs are?
Yeah, let me say one thing and then I'll turn over to the panel. One of the things that came out of the riots after OSU looked at itself was a move, and students had been clamoring for this for a long time, to get students more involved in the internal workings of the university. And students were on committees like traffic and parking, but they weren't on the major big committees that make like academic decisions and so forth. After all that occurred, the university made a decision to bring students in, both in terms of committees and other work. And in fact, when President Gee came 20 years later, he had a group of outside experts look at the university. And one of the things they complimented Ohio State on was its university senate, where faculty and students and administrators actually sat with each other, and that OSU had a much more effective self-governance system as a result. I think also sitting in on the Board of Trustees meetings that I did, the legislation that Ray supported that was eventually passed, it took a while, those students on the board really added a lot in terms of perspective. So I think that's one of the things that resulted in the university being a better place as a result of what happened.
Yeah, they actually do add an awful lot. It was Representative Michael Stenziano's bill. And yeah, I think all of us were co-sponsors, at least from Franklin County. I'm on the board of trustees at Central State University, even though I'm not a graduate of Central State. Our current governor appointed me to that board. And the student trustees make an incredible contribution. I wish that they had a vote even, because they bring so much information, perspective from the students. And they tend to be the leaders on the campus anyhow. They're not just involved within the trustees. They're leaders in student government and all of those other areas of the campus.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to quickly say, I have a child that was in law school at Ohio State, and he sat as a professional student on Council on Academic Affairs. And every so often I'd have a faculty member who was on that council say to me, you know, we love having your son. He can say things to the deans that none of us can because he's a student. And there is something wonderful about students. They can be, honest and tell you what they're thinking, and they don't get mixed up in the, campus politics. And so, yeah, I think students are much more engaged in the university today.
Bill, I'd like to make one final statement. This has been really fun for me and interesting. A historical trip. As I look around the room, I see a couple of dozen people that I interviewed while I was at WTVN, and I want to say to you now, I'm really sorry. I'm really not that mean.
Well, that's a good way. Okay, does sign language mean time for one more question or what?
Time for one more question. I'm
okay.
honored to ask it. I'm Andy Campbell. So to bring us to current times here, I'm really curious about kind of the speed of our communication and technology now with social media and those things, how those may have affected student communication had they had those tools then, but then also maybe how it affects reporting and journalism in this day and time.
The only statistic I've heard recently that rattles in my brain and will not go away is 47% of the people under 21 get 50% of their news from Facebook. I wish you a lot of luck.
Well, I don't have an answer to that question, but I do have another point that I would like to make in 10 seconds. I was reading an article in the paper yesterday. There were a group of students from Eastmoor Academy that were taken up to the university, and they were getting a pitch about concealed carry. That certainly would not have worked very well for us when I was a student at the university. If we had our guns, it would not have been so pretty. It's a terrible idea.
Let me add one other thing. In terms of whether something like this could happen again, I think the unique set of circumstances that occurred in the May of 1970 will hopefully never happen again in 150 years of the university's history. What could happen again are some sort of protests, as we talked about. The wild card, I think, is social media. And it's a wild card that nobody really, I remember one of the administrators telling me when I was interviewing him about how the university was responding to the 1970 riots, he said, Bill, you know, part of the problem was we had never been through something like this before. Well, if there's a social media inflamed action of some sort, it will be totally unprecedented, and people of an older generation will be trying to interpret how to deal with people of a younger generation, and that will be one hell of a challenge.
I hope you all enjoyed today's forum. I know I did. And we encourage you to continue this conversation with coffee and cookies, and they'll be right out there. Always very good discussions that end too soon. Our panelists, I hope, will stay and talk. You know, you can always view and share today's forum and all of our forums on CTV, Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio Channel, and anytime on CMC's website through YouTube. Our sponsor, the Robert Weiler Company, and our speakers, Ray Miller, Mabel Freeman, Bill Patterson, and Bill Shkurti. Please let's give them all a round of applause. And thanks to all of you for being here. We hope to see you soon again at CMC.